Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and completely demystify what hitting the $1 million milestone actually means today. I mean, we all have this deeply ingrained cultural image of the millionaire, right? The yachts, the private islands, this sense of unlimited freedom. But what really happens when the brutal math collides with that century-old fantasy? Well, today we're going to unpack the actual reality of $1 million.
So we're going to start with a guy named John. John and his wife Kara, they've been saving for 30 years. 3 decades of absolute discipline entirely for this exact moment. And finally, the number on John's screen crosses that magical $1 million mark. But what happens next? There are no fireworks, there's no champagne popping, no black cards sliding across fancy marble counters. Instead, they're standing in their kitchen, with the laminate countertops. And Kara's response to officially becoming a millionaire is just to ask, "Hey, did you remember to move the chicken from the freezer?" Literally, the biggest financial milestone of their lives arrives, and it is completely indistinguishable from every other Tuesday.
Which brings us to the core mystery of our explainer today. If John is finally a millionaire, why on earth doesn't his life feel like that word is supposed to feel? Why does hitting this legendary, mythical number feel so incredibly anticlimactic? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at what actually happened to the finish line while John was busy running the race.
Section 1. The Millionaire Myth. How inflation moved the finish line.
Let's start peeling the onion here by looking at the brutal math behind that cultural fantasy of the millionaire. Because the math brilliantly illustrates how inflation has quietly destroyed the fantasy. Look, we all know a dollar today doesn't buy what it used to, right? But seeing the actual numbers? Man, it gets uncomfortable fast. $1 million today buys roughly what $514,000 bought back in the year 2000. But if you go back to 1980, which is really when a lot of our cultural ideas about wealth were cemented, today's million only has the purchasing power of about $246,000 back then. The word millionaire hasn't changed at all, but the math underneath it quietly did. When people talk about millionaires like they're royalty, they're basically remembering a time when that money bought 4 times as much as it does today.
And you know what's fascinating? The culture actually knows the math has changed, even if we don't always say it out loud. Which is exactly why surveys reveal the new finish line for feeling rich is nowhere near 1 million. When you ask Americans how much money it actually takes to be considered wealthy today, the consensus is $2.3 million. That is the current going rate on the fantasy. It's literally more than double the number John just hit. He won a race for sure, but somebody quietly relocated the trophy decades ago.
Section 2. The brutal math. What does $1 million actually do? So let's transition from what $1 million feels like to what it functionally and mechanically does for you. If you want to know what $1 million actually does, you have to turn that big pile of money into an annual income. And the classic rule of thumb for this is the 4% rule. Basically, it means you take 4% of your portfolio in your very first year of retirement, adjust it for inflation each year after that, and historically speaking, you have a really good chance of not running out of money over a 30-year retirement span.
So here is the absolutely crucial point. $1 million portfolio throws off an income of exactly $40,000 a year. Just let that sink in for a second. The $1 million John chased for 30 years produces a completely unremarkable mid-career salary. $40,000 is a real budget with real hard edges. You're still checking the total at the grocery store before you tap your card. You're still sitting there deciding if you can afford to fly and see the grandkids twice this year, or maybe just once. The anxiety doesn't vanish at $1 million. It just kind of changes shape from will I ever have enough to please don't let me lose what I've built.
Section 3. Trapped equity and hidden costs. The money you can't actually spend. See, $1 million on paper is completely different from $1 million in your pocket because a massive chunk of that million is already spoken for before you even get the chance to spend it. First off, consider healthcare. The estimated lifetime cost for a 65-year-old couple retiring today is roughly $345,000. And honestly, that doesn't even include long-term care. So a big, ugly chunk of that hard-earned million already belongs to your future knee replacements. Then you've got your silent business partner, the government. If that million is sitting in a pre-tax retirement account, every single withdrawal is taxed as ordinary income. And the government, they aren't patient. By age 73, they enforce required minimum distributions, essentially forcing you to withdraw chunks of your money every single year, ready or not, just so they can finally tax it.
Furthermore, the liquidity problem is huge. When we break down the U.S. median net worth, it reveals that for most Americans who actually reach a high net worth, a massive portion of it is locked up in the equity of the house they live in. If the median net worth is around $193,000, strip out the home equity and it collapses to roughly $58,000. You can't spend your house. I mean, if John's water heater explodes, he might actually have to sit down and think hard about how to pay for it, despite technically being a millionaire on paper. It's kind of like owning a gold mine but not having the keys to get inside.
Section 4. Boring wealth versus flashy debt. The true profile of a modern millionaire.
All of this builds a completely different picture of who the real millionaires living right among us actually are. We can directly contrast John's quiet, boring wealth against his neighbor, Todd. The data shows most actual millionaires are incredibly normal people. They're teachers, accountants, engineers. John drives a 10-year-old paid-off Camry. He buys index funds. By every visible measure, he is entirely middle class. Meanwhile, Todd, 2 doors down, drives this expensive leased SUV, has a boat he uses maybe twice a year, and wears a watch that probably costs more than John's first car. Todd looks 10 times richer than John, but here's the catch. Todd is teetering on the edge of disaster. He's probably one slow month at work away from his entire financial life coming crashing down like a Jenga tower. The people who look rich and the people who are rich, they are very rarely the same people.
So, how did John actually do it? Well, getting to John's level requires surviving the absolutely brutal early phase of investing. The legendary investor Charlie Munger famously noted that the first $100,000 is just a nightmare, but you simply have to get through it. At the beginning, your money grows almost entirely because you just keep manually shoving savings into it. It literally feels like pushing a massive boulder up a hill with your bare hands. Most people never get to feel the magical momentum of compound interest because they just quit while they're still pushing.
But John didn't quit. In fact, he had a very specific, incredibly unsexy superpower. The uncomfortable truth hiding in investor data is that most people earn dramatically less than the funds they actually invest in. Why? Because they panic sell at the market bottom, they pile in at the top, and they just tinker constantly. John's real secret wasn't picking winning stocks or perfectly timing the market. His secret was doing absolutely nothing for 30 years on purpose. He bought boring index funds, and he waited. He got rich by basically being the most patient, least interesting guy at the party.
Section 5. Redefining Financial Freedom. The Psychology of the Moving Goalposts.
To wrap up this explainer, we really need to examine the psychological trap that prevents millionaires from actually enjoying their achievement. Because this statistic is just mind-blowing. Astonishingly, when surveyed, only around 8% of people with $1 million in investable assets actually call themselves wealthy. Think about that. The overwhelming majority of people who cross this massive finish line still consider themselves strictly middle class or maybe upper middle class. The people who have literally won the race are standing at the finish line telling you, hey, it doesn't feel like a victory. And this happens because human desire operates on what psychologists call a hedonic treadmill. When you make $40,000 a year, $100,000 looks like absolute freedom. But the second you hit $100K, your brain resets. That number just becomes your new floor, and suddenly your eyes drift up to the people making $250,000. By the time you hit $1 million in net worth, the baseline has reset so many times that the euphoric feeling you were expecting, it's permanently sold out. The goalpost isn't at the end of the field anymore. It's attached to your forehead, and it moves every single time you take a step.
Now, none of this means hitting $1 million is worthless. Far from it. $1 million net worth still puts you in the top 10 to 15% of households. The mistake wasn't reaching the million, the mistake was expecting a giant fireworks show instead of appreciating what it actually provides. Because the real reward is the quiet, totally unsexy freedom of a paid-off life. It is the absolute privilege of never having to lie awake doing terrifying survival math at 3 a.m. John's wealth doesn't look like a Super Bowl commercial. It looks like pulling a 10-year-old sedan out of a paid-off driveway while his neighbor wrestles with a boat he can't afford.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. As you navigate your own finances and look at the goals you've set for yourself, ask yourself, are you logically chasing a number that will provide you with quiet stability? Or are you endlessly running on a treadmill, chasing a feeling that a number can never actually buy?